Hello, welcome. Good afternoon. I'm Brian Schaffner. I'm a professor at Tufts University, and I'm president of the New England chapter of the American Association for Public Opinion Research. And today we have a great panel today. I want to thank Tatish Nateta and Tracy Kearns for organizing this terrific panel and helping put this together, focusing on the possibilities and pitfalls when polling subpopulations. There's a lot of P's in that title. I'm going to turn it over to Tatish in just one second, but I just want to say here that we are doing a lot at the New England chapter of AAPOR. We have lots of events happening. This is one of many online webinars that we've been doing in the last couple of years. We also are going to have our big annual mixer back finally after a couple of years of hiatus due to COVID. So if you're a chapter member or even just curious and being a chapter member, join us on June 16th at 6 p.m. At Remnant Brewery in Somerville for that event, and we'll have a chance to meet and greet everyone. Of course, many of us will also be at AAPOR in Chicago in a couple of weeks, so you can find us there as well. And again, if you're not a member of the chapter yet, but you might be interested in joining, consider doing so. We have, like I said, a lot of great events for you. But let me not take any more time because we have a terrific panel today, and you really want to hear from all of them. And so let me introduce the moderator of this panel. He's a professor of political science at UMass. He's also the director of UMass Poll, and he's currently president-elect and about to become president of NAAPOR. So let me turn it over to Tatish Nateta.
Thanks so much, Brian. So again, we have a really great panel for you today. And what I want to do is first to introduce our esteemed panel. So first we have Ray Block Jr. He is the Lawrence and Lynn Brown McCourtney Endowed Career Professor in the McCourtney Institute for Democracy and the Associate Professor of Political Science and African American Studies at Penn State. He's the author of Losing Power, African Americans and Racial Polarization in Tennessee, and the upcoming book, Protesting Vulnerability, Race and Pandemic Politics. In his free time, he is the Senior Research Advisor for the African American Research Collaborative, and it's an organization committed to providing high quality data on the political interests, motivations, and goals of African Americans. So please join me in welcoming Ray Block Jr. Our second panelist is John Della Volpe. He is Director of Polling at the Harvard Kennedy School Institute of Politics. He's also the author of Fight, How Generation Z is Channeling Their Fear and Passion to Save America. He directs the Harvard Youth Poll, which for over 20 years has provided a comprehensive exploration of the political opinions, voting trends, and views on public service held by a nationally representative sample of young Americans. He is also the founder and CEO of Social Sphere, a Cambridge-based analytics and public opinion firm, and has recently served as pollster and strategic communications advisor for President Biden and the Biden-Harris campaign. Please join me in welcoming John Della Volpe. Janelle Wong is our final panelist. She is Professor of American Studies at the University of College Park, my alma mater, so go Terps. She is the author of Immigrants, Evangelicals, and Politics in an Era of Demographic Change, a second book, Democracy's Promise, Immigrants and American Civic Institutions, and she's the co-author of Asian American Political Participation, Emerging Constituencies and Their Political Identities. She serves as the co-PI of the National Asian American Survey, which is a national representative survey of the Asian American community, conducted in 8 different languages with 6 different Asian national origin groups. She is also the co-director of AAPI Data, which is a polling firm committed to providing high quality and representative policy research and demographic data on Asian Americans. Please join me in welcoming Janelle Wong as well. All right, so before we begin, just a quick note about the format of today's panel. So what I'm gonna do is just ask the panel a few questions about their experiences, their thoughts, and their best practices in polling Asian Americans, African Americans, and young people. But feel free to add questions, and you'll see at the bottom of the Zoom there's a Q&A box, and so you can place your questions there. We also have some questions from audience members that pre-registered, and we'll try to incorporate all those questions closer to the end of the panel. And I'll do my best to get to as many audience questions as we have time for. All right, so let's begin. So again, thank you for all making time to talk about this really important issue. And I want to start with what seems like an obvious question, but I think an important one to just set the foundation. And we'll start with you, John, first. So the question is, what initially attracted you to specifically poll young people? So again, your work is nationally renowned in terms of providing high quality data on young Americans. So how did you get into polling young people?
Thanks, Tatish, and great to be with everybody. You know, it was never my idea to be a researcher focused on youth, to be perfectly honest. It was, which I think is terrific. It was the idea of two Harvard undergraduates, you know, 21, 22 years ago, essentially the first millennials to teach. And they wanted to better understand what they found as a seeming disconnect between community service and voting. It's seen back in those days, late 90s, early 2000s, that so many young people grew up going to a high school and volunteering in some meaningful way in community service. Many were able to kind of extend those opportunities through their college environments, but very few young people, as I noticed, were interested in even talking about politics at the Institute of Politics, where I sit today. The turnout in the 96 election was, I think, only a third of younger people under 30 participate. So they asked us to figure out this disconnect, you know, and it was a one-off. I was one of 3 professional pollsters in Boston those days, as I recall, and practicing, you know, and it was a one semester project, and I'm just so fortunate now, 43 semesters later, you know, to still be doing this, yeah, so that's what, you know, that's how I found it. What's attracted me to it, of course, is just the energy and the curiosity of the young people that I work with and that I understand. And of course, if you know, it's a little bit of a window right into the future about all of the debates that we're currently having. You know, really, I'm so optimistic by spending so much time around young people. So that's my story.
Great. How about you, Janelle?
That's such a fun question, because for me, polling started when I was an undergraduate, and I was an undergraduate in Dr. Melvin Oliver's class, and took a course also from Larry Bobo. And at the time, I was an undergraduate in 1992. This is the time of civil unrest in Los Angeles. I was at UCLA, and they launched a survey, the Multi-City Survey of Urban Inequality from 1992 to 1994. And I was fortunate enough to be one of the undergraduates who worked on that survey, and they just lit my mind on fire. And I realized that surveying was really a way to capture everyday voices in a way like no other. And I still believe that. So that's how I got involved in surveying Asian Americans. They were the first who introduced me to a survey of Asian Americans.
Great. Thanks so much. How about you, Ray?
All of these reasons are the ones that I use too. Mentors, the need for social change, you name it, right? But one of the things I'm going to do is talk about, you know, people say that you write the book that you want to read. For me, it was collecting the data I wanted to analyze. And as a tendency, a lot of nationally representative polls have small subsamples of minorities in them. And it's useful for generalization purposes if you care about demographic representation, but it's not always easy to answer the research questions you might have with those small samples. There are some academic polls that really lean into Black oversamples, for example, or have large enough samples of people in general that you can really go into this. But a lot of those surveys are maybe a step or two behind current events. And so I got into the work that I'm doing with the African American Research Collaborative because we like to create very up-to-date polls with hard to reach populations in them so that we can grapple with ongoing and current questions about what's going on in society.
All right, thanks so much. All right, so as Brian noted, our panel's entitled Possibilities and Pitfalls When Polling Subpopulations. It's the perfect title for me because it has all that great alliteration. And each of you is an expert in polling these historically difficult to reach populations. And so to start off our substantive discussion, can you provide us with an overview of the manner in which you most recently went about recruiting and interviewing respondents, and what you see as the sort of benefits and the costs associated with the political mode, the particular, mode of collecting survey data? And we'll start, let's start, Janelle, with that question. So, what manner of collecting survey data, what sort of mode of collecting survey data did you use most recently? And what are the benefits and the costs that you see in employing this mode?
Thanks so much. So, right now we're in the field right now, AAPI data, with a survey of voters in anticipation of the 2022 elections. And so this is our pre-election poll for 2022. And how do we do this? We start with a list of registered voters. And so that is our basic starting point. And then we work with partners who develop an algorithm to identify likely Asian American voters based on first, middle, and last name, as well as population density. And so we zero in on likely Asian Americans on that voter list. So that's the starting point. Why do we do that? Because, of course, most Asian Americans don't live in high density areas. Most Asian Americans are the non-white group that's most residentially integrated. And so we would have a pretty biased sample if we just went to those high density areas. At the same time, we can't abandon that focus, because when we use these listed names of likely Asian American names to identify those outside of those areas, then we're obviously not hitting some who don't have an Asian first, middle, or last name. And so we try to triangulate in using these different methods. We then translate our surveys into at least 3, often more languages. Right now we're working in 3, so we translate it into Chinese and Korean and Vietnamese, and we survey other groups in English. We identify likely groups within each national origin. So then we try to at least do 6 groups and organize the outreach that way. We do our surveys phone and online. We do that because online sampling right now for us and online mode does not usually maximize the foreign-born population. So the Asian American adult population, including registered voters, still tends to be more foreign-born than not. And as most of you know, online surveys only capture a small number of foreign-born people. We are much likely to reach those who want to take a survey in language with telephone, but that is becoming much harder. So that's a pitfall. And I'll try to wrap it up. It's a long, long process. It could go on because there's like back translation, but that is the basic kind of approach that we take, is starting with the voter list, doing translations, identifying people by national origin, and doing phone and online modes.
So you'll have, and sorry, I'm jumping into this just because it elicited a question. So you're also having to train folks to do those telephone surveys in the preferred language. And so that's also another step.
Correct. So this is another thing that we do, is we utilize bilingual interviewers. We also offer, of course, the online surveys are also, so, okay, I'll add one more thing. There is one other thing we do, which is we work with panels too. So there's the registered voter emails, but then there's also panels that survey firms have already have in place. But when we train our phone interviewers, yes, they are bilingual. That has its own pitfalls. Sometimes English dominant Asian Americans don't want to talk to someone who has an accent or who is bilingual. So there's a lot going on.
Yeah. All right. So I'll give this question to you, Ray. So what's the manner in which you went about most recently recruiting and interviewing African-American respondents? And what do you think the benefits and costs with the particular mode of collecting survey data that you employ?
So Janelle took everything, that all of the pitfalls, all of the things, right? Like, so similar to what she's talking about, like the idea that we have to meet participants where they are. So that's a combination of phone and online versions of surveys. And it also means thinking about whether or not the online recruiting and phone recruiting are things that are really picking up those populations if you're not getting initial hits from the folks that are actually being queried. I would also say we've been really leaning into panel vendors. And we, in our company, I guess if you want to call it that, it seems weird when I say it that way, we focus a lot on building relationships with potential list gatekeepers, if that makes sense, to really find out where we can go to specifically get African-American samples for the polling that we're getting into. But I don't feel like I'm adding anything to this that Janelle hasn't already mentioned.
All right, great, thanks. So John, I mean, I think you have a different set of challenges in terms of recruiting folks. You know, just based on my stereotypes of young people and my experience, it's really just hard to get in touch with them. They're so busy. And so what are some of the challenges that you faced with your most recent set of polling?
Sure. So the most recent set of polling at Harvard, especially for 12 years, we have partnered with the Knowledge Panel, the former Knowledge Networks panel, now owned and operated by Ipsos, government division. And that is an address-based sampling methodology, right? Which is a probabilistic sample. And while so that's basically the foundation. Over the years, over the last, I think, two and a half years, we've actually had to supplement, that sample with panel, non-probabilistic method as well, in order to kind of meet the quotas. Each of our surveys are between 2,000 and 3,000 young Americans under the age of 30. Okay, so that's the way. Which essentially now it's like half of the panel probabilistic, the other half are kind of the opt-in online panel. I think that obviously the pros are, for me, are obvious. We now have 12 years of tracking data, very comparable methodology. We spend a lot of time trying to promote the work of our students in the media, makes it much more, makes it easier to do that, of course, with that methodology. But the cons are significant, right? So it's at least 5 times the cost to use the knowledge panel than a series of carefully developed online panels. So that's a significant drawback, frankly, for us. We could do 5 times more surveys, essentially, right, with our students. So that's something, and I'm not sure that the differential. I know that the differential between the panel, the probabilistic versus non-probabilistic, and a lot of the work that we do is the differences are minor. Are minor. So that's something that we constantly grapple with in terms of how to best utilize our resources here.
Great. Thanks so much. All right. So each of you has an extensive history polling these difficult to reach communities, whether those are African Americans, Asian Americans, or young people. So what have you learned about each of these communities that pollsters and public opinion scholars more generally do not know, but should know and should incorporate into their surveys? And so I'll start with you, Ray. So given your history of polling African Americans, and as you said before, one of the reasons why you got into specifically polling African Americans was a lack of incorporation of, key questions and key issues that may necessarily be facing that community. So what have you learned in your polling, and how is this not reflected in, general surveys of the national public by pollsters and public opinion scholars? And what should they do in order to address this?
Okay, so I have a lot of them, but I want to stick to one, right? And I just think that things are just more complicated than they're often made out to be. And so this is really about public dialogue that links back to polling information. And one of the things that sticks out to me is the policy stuff regarding police reform especially as it played out in campaign narratives and how we see it in our data. And so we've ran several surveys and asked several types of questions over time. And we keep coming up to this trend, to this pattern. And the pattern is two things. On the one hand, generally, the people in our survey who are African-American are expressing a general not support for the idea of cutting funds to the police. And that's a discussion that goes counter to a lot of the dialogues that you see hovering around right now. But we also think a lot of this has to do with the degree to which the defund the police campaign rhetoric gets weaponized against the very populations that need this kind of reform the most, right? And that goes to the other thing, on the other hand, of specific interventions, things like funding for social workers and youth programs and stuff like that, get way more support than the more abstract version of the defund the police message. And we worry sometimes that the message is getting a little bit out ahead of us, in the sense that the things that we really want are the reductions in police violence and the over surveillance and under protection to be addressed. And we worry sometimes that some of those things aren't being paid attention to because the wording and the characterization of the debate is something that I don't think African-American voters are getting enough control over. And that other people, politicians, media, people that want to boost media narratives, et cetera, are exercising more control over.
Great, great. And so you're seeing this in your most recent polling, right? So since the murder of George Floyd, this has been a much more sort of nationalistic conversation, but in recent polling, you're seeing sort of a lack of congruence between what we're seeing in national polling on police reform and actually what's going on the ground in Black communities.
I just say it's complicated, you know what I mean? So it's not an open and shut case. And the fact that it isn't an open and shut case isn't something you should fight people's opinions over. More, what I think should really happen is the messaging should be more consistent with a more complicated story and perhaps a more specific story about what to do with the funding if it's not going to police stations, right? And thinking about the specific interventions that might actually be useful and effective for this.
Great, great. All right, John, how about you? So, you've been doing this for close to 20 years. What do pollsters and public opinion scholars not necessarily know about young people, but should?
Yeah, I think there are two quick things. The first of which is I lean very, very heavily in qualitative research. It's like our semesters winding up because I'm fortunate enough to have a kind of a private practice. I spend most of the summer traveling, talking to younger groups of people. A couple of things. When I do that, I find they are much more richer conversations. Actually, when I do slightly larger groups, rather than 8 or 10 around a table, I'll do 20 or so people in a big semicircle, more like a classroom, just us around a big circle or a semicircle. And that's where I get, I think, kind of some of the most significant insights. And specifically, it was 5 or 6 years ago where I was innocently asking the same questions I asked for 25 years, for 15 years. What connects us as Americans? How's your day going? What keeps you up at night? When I heard just the tremendous weight of the mental health crisis and the fear that was just inescapable from city to city, from group to group. So I don't think I would have identified that as quickly, through quantitative research had I not been listening in those settings. So heavily lean on that, and then also still kind of appreciating the fact of this mental health crisis, even within the context of the greater political crisis that we're having. I think those two things. The other thing that I think is significant is on a lot of questions, for example, on topics around healthcare, on education, as just a couple of different examples, on race, racism, policing, capitalism, I find that the differences between younger Democrats and younger Republicans, even though one could vote for Biden and one vote for Trump, are sometimes in the single digits. Whereas the differences between younger Republicans and younger Democrats could be 3 or 4 or 5 times that. Same thing with Democrats. So for example, one quick example on the issue of school choice, okay, younger Democrats and Republicans are more or less in line on that. They favor it, okay? But older Democrats have a 30-point difference in terms of how they think about that issue relative to their children. Same thing on the other side with teacher unions. Young Republicans have nothing against teacher unions. You know, their parents and their grandparents have big problems when you look at issues related to that. So appreciating that that in some cases, kind of generations, there are these generational value sets that transcend partisanship.
Yeah, so in some ways, the discussions about rampant and rife polarization look a lot different when we're looking at these younger generations who have been socialized in the same way, but don't necessarily have that extensive experience with the political system and are in the process of really sort of establishing their policy preferences, establishing their political identities. And that's really something that is not discussed, the generational differences in polarization. That's really interesting. All right, Janelle, last but not least, how about you? So what do you think?
Thank you so much. So one of the, because this is a room full of pollsters, some of the learnings have to do with sort of nuts and bolts. So, you know, what do people think about cost, right? When you're surveying Asian Americans, it's both more costly and takes longer. So an online interview, the cost per interview might be something around like $18 to $20 for a 20-minute interview. For a phone interview in language, we're talking about close to $200 cost per interview. Okay, so it really ramps up the cost, and that's why I think phone surveys are going to go away for these populations, even though it's one of the best ways to do an in language, ensure you get an in language and immigrant survey complete. The other thing is, you know, after doing these surveys for a long time, there's just a 3 to 5 minute, let's say you're doing a 10-minute survey, there's a 3 to 5 minute additional amount of time it takes to survey in language, especially a live interview. And so that also brings up the cost, right? So those things are like just practical considerations. In terms of substance, I think this aligns with what John is saying, that the meaning of partisanship, the way we think about partisanship really does vary by race. And Ray knows this as well. Similar to, you know, what Tasha Philpott has found, for instance, we find that Asian Americans, especially, let's say the most Republican leaning group, Vietnamese, right? As a slight majority voted for Trump. They were the only Asian American group to vote for Trump. Well, if we look at their policy views, the policy views of Vietnamese, they tend to be among the more left-leaning on policy. And so understanding that kind of, you know, I know in political science, we think partisanship is everything. Well, it depends. It depends on what you're looking at, and it depends on race. And so, you know, when it comes to support for affirmative action, healthcare, and the environment, gun control, Vietnamese are among the more left-leaning, even though they were more likely to vote for Trump. Another thing is, despite, you know, one of the key things I think people do realize now, and this is what makes polling Asian Americans difficult, is it's such a diverse population. Yes, we're diverse in terms of national origin, language, generation, religion, geography, I could go on. And yet public opinion research has shown us that there are some convergences. There is a there when it comes to Asian Americans. And that there has to do with the role of government and a preference for big government and more programs. And it has to do with, you know, Asian Americans are more, as a whole, even across party, more left-leaning on key issues like the environment, healthcare, gun control. They're a little bit more conservative and a little bit more disconnected when it comes to race and immigration.
So I'm just going to get a quick follow-up, and I know I've got some questions to get to, but that finding about Vietnamese voters is so interesting. How did you go about explaining sort of lack of connection between policy preferences and then vote choice? I mean, that counters a lot of what we know about the factors that are important in vote choice in political science.
Yeah, I mean, it's just really asking those key questions you have to ask about partisanship, vote choice, and then these policy views, right? And we do have some models out there, which are Black voters sometimes have the same kind of splits when it, you know, what is going to determine that vote choice you know, there's it's a little bit softer, I would say, for Vietnamese. It doesn't, they're Republican, and even strong Republicans will not necessarily, only a slim majority voted for Trump. It was not overwhelming.
Yeah. All right. So we've been sort of talking about the costs of polling these populations. And so John, you mentioned the high cost of polling young people, particularly sort of the employment of panels. And Janelle, you just spoke very clearly about the sort of high costs associated with polling these populations correctly. So I'm going to direct these questions to the two of you. So what, if anything, can be done to alleviate this problem and expand our ability to poll these important communities? And I'll start with you, John.
Sure. So the vast majority, Tatish, of my work outside of the two Harvard Youth polls, vast majority are off of panels, web-based panels, and you know, with the cost of acquisition per complete, you know, less than $5 a complete, between $2 and $5, probably like $2 or $3 is where it averages. Now, to do that, right, I'll share a little bit in terms of like the data collection and the sampling process, right, which is extensive. It took us quite a long time to do that. But you know, we use a nested quota system, okay, where we're nesting age, race, gender, education by 4, okay, and then we use kind of this a raking methodology for weighting, okay. So when you do both the first step, that quota, the nested quota approach with the weighting, you know, we've got, you know, very, very positive results. We recently did a survey where on our own, where half of the survey was done using the probability-based panel, the other was developed using this methodology. And we checked everything, 75 or so questions. We saw on average, you know, the probability-based sample had a higher level of don't knows consistently throughout, you know, 3 or 5 point don't knows, whereas the non-probability had a higher level of like the soft support, right? The second and third categories there. But when you looked at the big picture, the top 2 choices, you know, those things kind of evened out quite well. When we do that, we spend specifically with younger people, we look very carefully, of course, in terms of levels of political participation, you know, through each of those demographic groups. We spend a lot of time looking too at like online social media, technology use, et cetera, just to make sure that we're comfortable with, you know, with that process in terms of where we are, to make sure that we don't need to kind of further calibrate. But I think if you apply that approach, and Pew has written a lot about some of the best practices around that, you know, we feel that we can just do much more. So therefore, last thing I'd say is we average, you know, for younger people and others, like average probably 3,000 interviews using that methodology, right? So we can have enough of a robust sample size to look at the important subgroups that are represented on this call and others, right? And the last thing I'll just say on this point, and frankly, I think it's one of the things I learned and have the greatest level of appreciation for the Biden campaign. You mentioned that I had worked on that campaign. There were 5 pollsters on that campaign. And we had 1 pollster and 1 team focused exclusively on the African-American vote. We had another team of experts focused exclusively on the Hispanic Latino vote. I focused, of course, on younger people, and we had other experts who focused on the politics of the swing states, battleground states, and others. But I think it's the online methodologies allow us to collect more data and see some of the insights within the subpopulations of the subpopulations.
Right. So in general, do you think your poll is going to move away from probabilistic methods and sort of embrace a little bit more the panel method, or are you guys going to continue the sort of half the division?
Well, it's an ongoing conversation. You know, frankly, a lot of this, I think, has to do with the media. You know, and it's important, frankly, to make sure that our research is, you know, is written about in some of the major publications. So once they open up and once they learn about, I think this conversation, other conversations like this, I think they open up, and then I think we can go there because it's more opportunity for more data for our students and for all of us.
Yeah, great. So I'll ask you, Janelle. So you talked about the costs, and the costs, particularly with polling Asian Americans, are extremely high. And so do you think there are any ways to try to alleviate this problem, not just for you, but thinking about future generations of scholars who want to continue the work that you've done?
Yeah, I will definitely credit my colleagues, Angela Houghton, who runs AARP's research division, and also Neil Ruiz at Pew. And for years, they have been talking about a panel survey of Asian Americans. And here's the kind of cost analysis is, do we keep investing, you know, $200 to $500 to $1 million into separate surveys of Asian Americans with either a registered voter frame or some kind of listed sample, or do we work together and try to invest in a true, initially is an address-based kind of framework that is high quality in terms of initial sampling, and then create a sample, a shared, it's not sample, a shared panel that can be a cooperative. And that, I think, that is like a $10 million effort, because it's, of course, Asian Americans are still less than 7%, around 7% of the population, right? And so it is extremely hard to build that initial panel in a way that we all feel we can trust and is representative. But I think that is the dream. And in the end, we're getting close to having invested that many dollars in separate surveys. So why not try to do something that in the end will be more cost effective and can be shared?
Yeah. And there are a number of different examples of that, out there. The CCS that Brian has worked on, you can imagine something like that potentially for each of these subpopulations. So that's great. So, we all have our various war stories, and it'd be great to hear some of yours. So given again your extensive history of polling, what have been the central challenges you faced in polling these communities, and how did you best address these issues? So I'll start with Ray for this question. So, given your history of polling African Americans, both, with the organization and your scholarly history, what is the sort of central challenge you faced, and how did you go about trying to solve that?
Yeah, so I keep going back to the idea of being able to do both and be successful in the arenas you're in while doing both. And it still remains not a natural career path for a social scientist like me to also be in these polling circles and these survey design circles, And so a lot of those challenges are just naturally the kinds of challenges that come with being in those two spaces, right? But I will say that with the African American Research Collaborative, we've had a lot of growth challenges. And I think two examples really bring this home. And one of them comes from a project that we were working on reproductive justice. And Janelle's smiling because she's intimately familiar with this particular project. And the challenges because what we typically do is we work with clients. Clients have certain things that they're interested in learning. And polling is one of many ways you can get at those things. And our job typically is to work with clients to think about what the needs are, to translate those needs into instruments, and then use those instruments to query and to learn and to disseminate evidence once you get it. And because of the experience we had not very long ago with that particular project, two things emerged that were like growth challenges. One is folks at the AARC are doing more qualitative research now than they were before. So like what was potentially a mainly quantitative polling firm is now a mixed methods polling firm, precisely because the need is there. And two, because of that, we are now thinking about what it means to now navigate in these spaces where the research questions are multifaceted and require different types of answers to those questions, right? Another one, I'm thinking about another project that we worked on, and this was with an organization that's known for providing information to its members about Black history and about race and culture. And we had never worked with an organization like that before. And so the challenge was, how do we work with this organization? Because they had questions that they wanted to learn about their membership. But we as social scientists and pollsters and practitioners wanted to know, what would it mean to partner with an organization like that long term, where the organization can become part of the quote unquote lists that are being used for the types of samples that we're trying to get access to, but also thinking about what it means to partner up with clients that don't typically look like the clients we normally go with, right? But those are the challenges that immediately come to mind. It's like, how do you grow and do work that's going to be quality and relevant, but maybe a little different than the things you typically do? And because of that, the AARC is sort of moving away from just doing only political surveys, for one, doing more work that's mixed method or some combination of sequences of qualitative and quantitative research, and thinking about different client bases that we serve.
Great, thanks so much. Janelle, how about you? So, what is the sort of central challenge that you faced, and how did you go about addressing that issue? Because again, one of your surveys, one of the first nationally representative surveys that are, in of a number of different Asian American ethnic groups and in different languages. And so I imagine there were a number of surveys, a number of challenges in 2008 and then again in 2016. So just in general, like, what are the central challenges you faced?
So the challenge one is, I think I'll put in a caveat that the survey is national in scope. I don't know if it's nationally representative. We weight it so that it is, but it's definitely not a population-based survey in that sense. But the main challenge remains the challenge that in some ways that we all face, which is the sampling continues to be challenging. Who's picking up that phone? Who's answering an online survey? When you ask people in this room, your classrooms, anywhere else, they're not completing surveys. So who is doing that? And we're trying to figure out exactly who's completing and how they look similar or different to the population remains an issue for us. But beyond that, I think is also the additional challenge. So everyone's facing that. Having to phase out phone and move to online for our community is especially challenging because we know there are huge differences in the type of person who will answer a phone survey versus take an online survey. And that has major implications. So in our community, those who are English dominant, who are US born, for instance, who are younger, they are more likely to report discrimination because they might even have a different understanding of what discrimination is, right? And so we, as people who study discrimination, it's really challenging to try to estimate, what the effect of moving that mode is on the actual reporting out of these discrimination experiences. So those kinds of things. And then, of course, translation is always an issue. Even the term race or racism may be translating across different languages in ways that none of us, even on the team, have the language capability to be able to compare across these languages. So you could see how, it's, I guess, one of the main challenges is how to keep people in this space doing this work, because it is, and training another generation. It's nice to get that data set, but it is actually not that fun to collect those data.
But it's definitely worth it. It's definitely worth it. All right, so I'm gonna move now to some of the audience questions that we've garnered since we began, and amongst those who pre-registered. And so the first one came in the Q&A during our discussion, and I'm going to expand it a little bit so I can incorporate John's perspective as well. And so the audience member asked, will there ever be a remedy for the mistrust between minorities and institutions that might impact the truthfulness of their answers to polling questions? And I'll add young people, because anyone who is in a classroom with young folks recognizes the rampant sort of pessimism that people have regarding the American political system and its ability to respond to their interests. And so I think this is also an important question for John. And the audience member goes on to say, if so, what steps might need to be taken in order to ensure that polls are taken seriously and therefore have an accurate representation of the opinions of the people who take them. So in essence, I mean, how can we, as pollsters of these particular communities, communicate the legitimacy of our surveys and combat that increasing pessimism and mistrust that we see in a number of different populations? And so, John, I'll let you take that one first.
Sure. I think there's, to me, there's, I think of two areas. The first of which is the importance of the questionnaire development to make sure we have as much diversity represented as possible. You know, we talk about some of the challenges I have on this campus, and I think that's why our survey, you know, thankfully has been so relevant for 21 years, is that our the curiosity of our students and their ability to kind of listen, but still, you know, we're constantly trying to find ways to kind of learn from other groups less engaged in politics on our campus and on campuses and off campuses around the country. So always making sure that we're in touch with the everyday concerns and the ways in which people express those concerns is just critically important, especially with these hard to reach populations, of which, you know, they're not represented here, but like older white conservatives from small town rural America would also fit very carefully right into that mix. One. On the methodology point of view, you know, we're constantly kind of listening and reviewing, looking for best practices, but, you know, we're beginning to add questions related to, you know, vaccination status, you know, and trust in neighbors and faith in the civic institutions, et cetera, as another way to make sure that we're calibrating properly, and especially kind of in the opt-in work relative to what we know the known population is through ACS and other work. So those are the two ways in which I think about that question. It's a great question.
Great. How about you, Ray?
I want to shift gears a little bit and think about how the survey data is interpreted, right? So everything that John said is right. But what I've noticed is with a lot of the clients that we work with, they're expressing concerns to us. And like one of those concerns is, yeah, if y'all do this poll, you're just going to use this data for your own personal purposes, right? Or you're going to use it against us in some kind of way, right? And so go back to 2020, and there was a big conversation about Black dudes voting for Trump. And it took up a lot of oxygen in like media narratives and some of the social media narratives that I was in, right? We didn't find any statistically significant difference between Black men and Black women when it comes to Trump support. And we spent a lot of time kind of going into those spaces to say this, because it was one of those sort of like not necessarily important from a vote prediction standpoint, even though some people made it out to be. But one of those things that would make people hesitant to take polls if they think, for example, that information like this is just going to be used as a divisive tool when it comes to what we learn about Black America. And I think some of this is the reason why we need more pollsters from underrepresented communities doing polling work, because it will suggest to people, even if it's not true, right, that the work is being treated in a different way or valued in a different way, or the reasons might not be purely academic or purely political, but just genuinely to learn more about what these populations have to give us. And the instrument becomes a tool for that.
Great. How about you, Janelle?
Yeah, I don't have the answer for that. It is a little scary going forward to think about who's not answering because the lack of trust is there, and that is layered on top of suspicion of academic institutions more generally now. And I'm sure you're all seeing, you know, in your own work that it's really hard to recruit some Republicans to take part in, especially academic polling efforts. And so that means that you're relying more heavily on waiting and doing more heavy recruitment to, try to get enough Republicans to have these efforts make sense to people. So I'm very worried about the future of completes.
Yep. I mean, it's something that I think we're all dealing with. And I think in this sense, this necessitates a discussion in the larger media about the role of polling in our society. I don't know if that's necessarily been communicated correctly. And maybe that's something that we as pollsters and public opinion scholars need to do a better job of when we are interacting with the larger public. All right, one more audience question, and then what I want to do is sort of transition to what you guys are working on now and what you think you're going to be working on as we sort of get closer to the midterm. So this last question, I will have John address it, and then we'll have one final question about future work. So the audience member says, some researchers have used social media, i.e. Facebook groups, WhatsApp groups, to reach out to hard to reach populations. What do you think about such a trend? And could you please suggest how we can or should integrate findings we obtain by using such methods?
So I would use those methods kind of as the input to questionnaire design and instrument design, in terms of the qualitative session. What do we need to know? What do you want to ask about? What are the biggest misconceptions to tackle some of the questions we have there? But I just think that through the kind of the better run marketplaces, again, the access to high quality data, high quality responses, again, if we're using the right sampling techniques, et cetera, are accessible as ever. So I use those on the front end in terms of the qualitative discussion.
Okay, so just a clarifying question. I'll just address this to Ray and Janelle, and this comes from the audience questions as well. What do you think about incentives to improve response rates with the communities that you have historically polled? And do you employ those? And have you found that the use of these incentives, whether they're monetary or material or symbolic, whatever it is, has increased response rates and the quality of responses that you've garnered? Ray, you can hit it first.
This kind of does two things at once. So I'm thinking about a future project that I'm working on, which is a primarily academic research project that will utilize African-American research collaborative data. And we're going to be looking longitudinally at the influence of misinformation on people's opinions about what to do to navigate and to mitigate the spread of COVID. And one of the things that we're tinkering with is this notion of a sliding scale for incentives, where we offer larger incentives as needed to make sure that participants stay inside of the panel for the longitudinal study. So like we've been typically working with organizations that as part of our recruiting tool, we use these types of incentives. But I don't think we've ever before used a, differential scale for thinking about how to actually apply those incentives to keep people involved.
Okay. Janelle?
Yeah, I've used incentives. I 20 years ago, I would never have dreamed of it because we were taught in our public opinion courses that incentives would corrupt your whole sample and you would mess up your study. But yeah, I've used incentives very heavily, and especially when you're talking about working with panel vendors, they are using incentives. So I think we can collect data in multi-mode. So I do have a study out right now. We're not using incentives. Are we getting a high response rate? No. So you can increase your response rate with incentives, of course, but is the quality good? It's really hard to say. I think we need to continue to do these kinds of experiments to see if what are the biases when you're paying people.
Yeah.
But otherwise we can't do this work.
Yeah, that's just the reality of the situation. All right, so we have about 6 more minutes, and we definitely want to get a sense of what the next thing is for each of you. So we're coming up on the midterm election in 2022, and we are 2 short years away from a presidential election in 2024. So what are your plans for polling in 2022 and then looking towards 2024? And I know as a political scientist, everything revolves around elections. And so this definitely demonstrates my bias. So we'll start with you, John. What are your plans for 2022 and then looking forward to 2024?
So we just released the poll just a few days ago, and I think one of the more interesting questions that I want to better understand over the next couple of months is that we're coming off of 2 cycles with record participation in voting of younger people, right? The 2018 midterms essentially doubled the last 30-year average for participation from 15 or 16 to in the mid 30s. I was confident that would happen because we saw this dramatic change of attitude about the efficacy of political engagement post-Trump and post-Parkland. Okay, now today those numbers have been dialed back significantly. So if I'm looking just at those attitudinal factors, which for 20 years have been predictive of turnouts, I'd be pretty pessimistic in terms of youth participation on one hand. On the other hand, every other measure about likelihood to vote and political activity that I've been tracking for so long indicate that's the same or if not increasing a little bit, right? So the question I want to understand is this generation capable of holding those 2 competing views? The system is less effective, but I still want to vote. And I think that could be yes, because of the urgency and the interest in using government to solve a lot of the systemic issues that have been raised in this call. But I need to understand that much more between now and November.
Great. All right, how about you, Janelle?
So we have we should have a report out in mid-July, a pre-election poll for 2022 in multiple languages with different national origin groups. And then going into the future, I think the interest is still around how especially immigrant communities are affected by misinformation, disinformation, and then ultimately how that's impacting their commitments to democracy.
Great. Ray, last but not least.
Hey, so we're cooking up some stuff for a midterm election poll, and we call it an election eve poll. We're thinking about ahead for what that's going to look like. And again, I'll just say that at AARC, we're trying to become more evergreen. So when politics isn't the dominant thing that's going on, we're doing social topics now. And of course, COVID is one of those social topics. A poll that we would love to get to at some point in the future would be one on people's perceptions of discrimination in the provision of healthcare. And thinking about that with cross samples of racial and ethnic minorities and white respondents too. But those are some examples of what we might be up to.
Okay, great. So thank you, each of you, for taking the time out to have what I hope was an insightful conversation about not only your experiences, but your sort of ways in which you think the polling community can deal with the challenges that you've experienced and to improve the data that we collect about Americans. So again, thank you, Janelle. Thank you, John. Thank you, Ray, for taking the time out to have this discussion. And I assume that if anyone has any follow-up questions, they can get your information, your contact information from each of your websites. This was a really great conversation. Hopefully it's the first of many discussing, again, the pitfalls and the potential and the positivity of looking at these particular populations in America, in American politics. So thanks again. I hope everyone has a great weekend and look out for more NAAPOR events this summer and into the next year. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Satish. See you later.
Bye.